Hey, we're live. Hi, everyone. This is Melanie Yazzie here with Red Power Hour. We've been gone again for a beat. I think it's been like 3 months since we recorded. I know, it's like the scare face. We keep promising to do it more, and then we don't. But it's really nice to be back here with Elena. Want to say hi, Elena?
Hello, this is Elena Ortiz calling in from Ogapoke, Oinge, and I'm excited to be back too. I think the last one we did was Planet of the Apes.
Oh, it was. Wait, when did we do that? Was that June? Was that July?
It might have been July. It might not have been as long as we think it has been. We did all three movies that day.
Yeah, we went hard.
Or four.
Okay, so before we get it, so we're gonna do another movie review today. Just give you some light listening. Although we're gonna go in on this movie like we do always with the things we review. But uh, one of my colleagues, actually at the University of Minnesota, where I work, he's an Indigenous comic artist and like an Indigenous children's book writer. So he's like a graphic novelist, I think is the correct term. But he listens to our podcast, and he told me that the episode we did back in February about Dune 2, I think it was called Riding the Worm. He said that it blew his mind. Okay, I'm not going to lie, because I'm like an academic and we're like revolutionaries and stuff. I often feel like these episodes where we just trash movies essentially kind of feels like low hanging fruit. It's kind of like, I really enjoy it. And I know, Elena, you really enjoy it, but it almost feels like it's not as hard hitting as like the news roundups that we've done in the past, or like the interviews that like Comrade Nick does in other parts of the Red Nation podcast. But this colleague did tell me, he's like, we made a comment during that episode that all science fiction is essentially just about colonization. And he said it blew his mind. He had never thought about it that way. And he's a huge sci fi fan, huge Star Wars fan. And he said he thought about that for weeks after he listened to that episode. And he said he realized, as an Indigenous person, he's Anishinaabe, he's from here in Minnesota, Makoche. But he said that it helped him realize why he is so unsatisfied all the time by science fiction. Even though he loves it, there's always this thing about it that really bothers him. And he was like, when we said it's because it's just about colonization, it like blew his mind. And he's somebody who produces, he loves sci-fi. He wants to write sci-fi. I think he's actually writing a sci-fi novel right now. Anyway, but he was like, it totally helped me think about what an Indigenous perspective on science fiction would be. And I was like, okay, I guess these episodes aren't so, they're not throwaway episodes. Not that I think that they're throwaway episodes, but you get what I'm saying? Like they don't feel as like packing the punch the way that the other ones do.
Yeah, they're not as light and sort of surface. I mean, when you look at films, and especially when films started to be really so, the first ever moving picture was filmed at Acoma Pueblo. I don't know what year, but it was Albert Einstein. I'm sorry, not Albert Einstein. Sorry, Thomas Edison.
It's going to be one of those days.
One of those big names in something. One of those white old guys. So Thomas Edison filmed the first moving picture at Acoma Pueblo. And since then, I think film has always been viewed as pop culture, not really art, or not an art form,
Mm.
or not as expressive as literature, but it really does tell a lot of stories about where we are, the time we're in, how attitudes and values and morals and ethics change. So I think it is. I think film analysis can be hard hitting. If you're not looking at, and I'm saying this right before we're about to dive into a film that we both loved for all the wrong reasons, it can be hard hitting if you're looking at it from a political perspective and you're looking at it as what it says about, this so-called United States colonial project. What is it saying about where this country was at the time the films came out, or at the time that it was decided that they would move from literature to big screen? And I
Mm.
think it can be something that's really valuable to look at historically. So
You know what? Those are all excellent points. I did not know the first moving picture, if that's what it was called, was filmed at Acoma. Okay, so I probably read this sometime when I took like a Native American film kind of course or whatever, that Native people were there at the inception of cinema, at least American, what would be considered as American cinema. So it would be ridiculous and completely ahistorical to not talk about the relationship between Native people and film, or just media, especially Hollywood, more broadly, film and TV. And that also makes me realize that, there still isn't a lot written academically or even popularly, from like an Indigenous perspective on film. Now, we've talked a lot on RPH about how the representation of Native people in TV and film has increased, like Reservation Dogs was kind of a flagship example of this. However, being able to find good spaces for like analysis and criticism, like Indigenous or Native analysis and criticism in film and television, that is still quite rare, I would say. So hopefully we're doing a service, a service for the masses here. We obviously have a lot of perspectives, not even just opinions, but like I feel like you and I give some pretty good grounded analysis of the colonial unconscious of pretty much all of the things that we watch, which we're going to talk about again today.
and just a plug for anyone who's interested, there is a great book that was written by Beverly Singer, who is a board member of Red Media, and her book is called "Wiping the War Paint Off the Lens," and it is about Indigenous filmmaking. So it's not so much about representation, but about more of a historical. This is who was doing what when, and this is sort of the evolution of Native storytelling in film. It's a good book.
Yeah, there's also a more recent scholar. She's a historian. We were hoping she would join us today, but I'm sure she'll join us for a future episode where we're going to do a takedown of Taylor Sheridan and everything, all the crap that he produces. A Cherokee scholar and historian named Liza Black. Oh, I forgot what her book is called, but her first book was also about Native American, like Native people in film, and from a historical perspective. So those are two sources, Beverly and Liza's work. I know that there are more, and I really apologize if I'm missing some of the pivotal books and Indigenous scholars who've written about this. Well, cool. So why don't we just hop into it? What are we talking about today, Elena?
So, Last of the Mohicans, and I will thank our producer Sina. He loves it when we do film analysis of popular culture stuff, and I think it was after he and Nick and I did The Searchers. And he said, "Yeah, these are great. We need to do more of these." And I said, "Well, there's a ton of movies out there we could talk about." And I said, "We've never talked about Lost of the Mohicans, which was one of my favorites years ago." And before I really became um, hardcore politically active, I mean, I saw the film when I was in college. So I was in film analysis already, but it's hard to separate the film, the cinematography from the political. I mean, obviously it it's a challenging film because it was based on a novel or a series of novels by James Fenimore Cooper, about the early colonization of what became the United States. And so it was pop culture in the 1800s. And
Oh, so the James Fenimore Cooper novel was pop culture in the 1800s? Because that
the
novel is
leather
old.
stocking tales, yeah, the leather stocking tales would be considered pop culture
Oh,
in the 1800s. It was sort of almost like a romanticization. I can't say that word.
Romanticization.
Romanticization of, we're 100 years in to the colonization of America, what became the United States of America. So he was writing about the mid 1700s, and he was writing it in the 1800s. So this is the sort of this romantic, nostalgic view of what it was like, and you throw in a little historical, the French and Indian War. You throw in a little historical fact, and people just ate those books up. A romantic hero or two, although I don't think Natty Bumbo was particularly romantic. Why this character? Why this time period? Why this author? And then why this film? And this film that we're talking about came out in 1992. It's a Michael Mann film. And so it's like an action film. That's what it is. It is not a romance. It is not a historical romance. It's an action film. And why then? Why did it come out? Cena was just talking about, why this and Dances with Wolves came out in a very similar time span, which coincided with sort of America's triumph over communism, which we can talk about later. But that's what we're going to talk about.
Where to start? Okay, thanks for that background info. I didn't really know that this was considered like pop fiction or like pop culture back in the day when it actually came out. Not surprised, because we're going to talk more about this, that it was just kind of, it was extremely popular with people who were reminiscing about the original kind of colonial moment, the original conquest of Turtle Island, that moves from the east, the East Coast, what we understand as the East Coast, to the West Coast. Because I very much think that when this movie came out in 1992, it was also serving the same purpose, right? The same purpose of, as much of, sorry, I was reading about Taylor Sheridan before this because we really want to record a podcast on it. But as much as like Taylor Sheridan's work in what year are we in, 2024, is also about allowing like white settler Americans to reminisce about like their identity as Americans forged through like pure violence and brutality, i.e. conquest. And this is how like the nation kind of shores up its identity over and over again, as it moves forward historically. But anyway, we can talk more about that later. I was thinking that maybe at the beginning, you and I could just give our confessionals about what this movie meant to us personally as Indigenous women. Obviously, you and I are different ages. But for me, I was a teenager. Well, I wasn't really a teenager. I was in middle school when this movie came out. I was a preteen. I was a preteen when this movie came out. So, I'm hetero. And so I'm like thinking about boys at this time, right? Haven't really had, a relationship with boys, but it's on my mind. I'm a pre-adolescent, that's pretty common for most people. And then Last of the Mohicans comes out. And you just have like Daniel Day-Lewis, and I forgot the actor's name who plays the son, Uncas, but Russell Means, who I did not have any notion, I did not know who he was, like as an important political figure. He's playing the father, and they're just all these like very beautiful men. And I was saying earlier, like it is not okay these days to objectify people that you're watching on film, but the young pre-adolescent version of me, seeing beautiful men running through woods and like hunting deer and saving damsels in distress and like shooting muskets and stuff like that. Like that was my main reason why I really loved this movie when I was young. And I watched it many, many times. I have two older sisters, and they also really loved the movie for very similar reasons. And so, I don't know, also as like a young Native kid, still struggling with, like identity issues or feeling secure just in my own skin. I was like projecting my weird indigeneity onto the movie. I'm like, oh, is the way that like Magua talks, is that the way you're supposed to talk as an Indigenous person? So anyway, that's my confessional. Full disclosure, I was a dumb young person. And that was my response initially to the movie. I loved it. My sisters, well, we'll say one last thing. My sisters, who are a little bit older than me, I'm the youngest, because they were teenagers, basically at this point. They loved the music and they got the soundtrack. We got the tape. If people remember what tapes are, in 1992, we had the tape of the Last of the Mohicans soundtrack. My sisters engineered that to make that happen. And we listened to that soundtrack like constantly. When we would go on long road trips as a family, we would pop in the Last of the Mohicans track. Because, I mean, that shit's good. I don't think it has anything to do. There's like a little bit of like indigenous stuff in the soundtrack, but the soundtrack is timeless. It's epic. If you listen to it, it'll probably be one of your favorite movie soundtracks you've ever listened to, because it's just really good. And I feel it pains me to say that. I know I'm gonna get heat for that, and I understand, but I think I'm still gonna die on that hill, because I re-listened to it and I was like, oh, this is good. So that's my confessional.
And what's funny is when you and I first talked about it, we both had the same confession. It's like, yeah, it's a problematic film, but God, I loved it. The music. I had the music also. In fact, I probably still have CDs I burned with the soundtrack on it. And when I watched the film again a few weeks ago, I kind of, oh, yeah, that music is great. I was a little older. I was in college. So I was driving down from Santa Fe to Albuquerque to attend film class, which were always in the evenings. So you had the lecture and then you watched the film. And oftentimes what I would do is I would go to the lecture, and if it was a film I could get on videotape, I would go home and rent it and watch it at home. That way I didn't have to be driving so late. But I wanted to stay down in Albuquerque and watch this film with the class. There were a lot of Native women in there. And of course, it was split pretty evenly. The men didn't like it. The women loved it. And I actually bought it on videotape.
Oh, so did we.
VHS.
We love this movie.
Yeah. Yep. And I watched it all the time. It was my go-to movie. And we've had conversations about the go-to movies. Like, if you're bored, you're lonely, you're tired, you just want to watch something and you don't care what it is. This was, of course, for me, the time way before you had streaming services or anything like that. So I would pop this film in the VCR and watch this film. And it wasn't until, and I was in film class at the time, and I understood about film analysis, and I still love this film. So it took a lot. It took a lot for me to start watching this with a critical eye and say, oh yeah, this is a declension narrative. It's problematic. And, I looked at Dances with Wolves at the same time and hated it. But for some reason, this film I really liked. And I don't know whether it was the soundtrack along with, and they both had, like, when I was younger, like middle school, high school, we didn't have films with Indigenous actors. And so there wasn't an opportunity to engage with those actors. And I think Dances with Wolves and Last of the Mohicans were the only, films at the time that had actual Native actors. And Eric Schweig is the one who played Uncas.
Eric Schweig. Yes, Eric Schweig. That's his name.
And he went on to be in a lot of things. He's one of the OGs. A little bit later, well, maybe not even, than Wes Studi, who's also in this film. But Eric Schweig went on to star in a series put out by the Canadian Broadcasting Network called, oh God, it wasn't North of 60. That was a different one. Canadian Broadcasting has put out some decent stuff. But there was another show, I'll have to think of what it was, that he starred in. So he's an OG. He's quite a good actor, although he didn't get very much screen time in this show. He was there just for you to look at. And, you
I was
know,
not complaining back in the day. That's for sure.
that was not a bad thing. And then, Daniel Day-Lewis, of course, but also the cinematography, the way this film is shot and the beauty. It's supposed to be in upstate New York. It's supposed to be, during the French and Indian War. It's supposed to be Mohawk or Six Nation versus Hurons, who were at that point enemies. It was actually filmed in North Carolina. It was filmed in the Great Smoky Mountains, but it's a beautiful film. And yeah, I still can watch it. I mean, I still don't have a problem watching it.
Being filmed in the Great Smoky Mountains, that makes sense, like with the vistas, because I've only been to that part of the Appalachian Range once, and it's like it's stunning. It's incredibly beautiful. So now I can identify that cinematography because I didn't know that that's where it was filmed.
And for those of us who were raised in the desert Southwest, that is beautiful to look at.
Yeah, it's a bit of a fantasy, actually. How green and lush and dense the forest is, and then all of the water, just the waterfalls that they, all the water that they're traversing as whatever the plot of the movie. We can talk more about the plot of the movie. Yeah, there was something about that, and then the cinematography of those landscapes was really sweeping, and it just sorry, it was very emotive. Like the movie draws you in. It's a well made movie. I just personally think it's a well made movie. The cinematography is incredible, and the music is also very emotional. And so, yeah, the movie has, even though it's interesting that you say it's an action film because the director is Michael Mann. I mean, the main story is Daniel Day-Lewis and Madeline Stowe. She plays the love interest. Her character's name is Cora, and Daniel Day-Lewis's character is Hawkeye. Their love story is kind of the center through line, through the entire film. And so it is like a love story, like on the war-torn frontier, where like savagery meets civilization. That's basically what the movie is about. And she becomes like, there's a whole captivity narrative that I can also talk about more later, where she's the white woman of like an English general, and but then she falls in love with her captors or whatever. Daniel Day-Lewis, even though he's like playing Indian, he's a white guy, even though he's been adopted, every anthropologist's dream, by the last of the Mohicans, which is the father and the son. Russell Means is the father. Eric Schweig is the son / his brother. So they fall in love against the backdrop of this epic war, right? Where the world feels like it's being turned upside down. So there is a lot of action. I mean, there are a lot of war scenes, there are a lot of fight scenes, but I feel like I can understand in terms of like a gendered response, like you were saying, like men in your film class hated it and women loved it. There is something extremely romantic and romanticized about the movie itself. Creates that kind of feeling. It's kind of, there's like a damsel in distress, like a captivity narrative that also is happening. And so, yeah, there's something it's an interesting movie when it comes to gender, because the main characters are all these like men, these like rugged Native men, and all the English men are just kind of like pathetic compared to the Mohicans, plus Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yep.
And so there's a commentary about frontier masculinity and like what is a strong man versus like a weak man. I can totally see why women would respond really positively to that. Even though it is like a very hyper masculine film, it's kind of like a film that's commenting on masculinity more, maybe for like a women's gaze or something like that, is kind of how that movie felt. Because also universally, I'm pretty sure like pretty much only women really like that film. I don't know how many Native women are listening to us right now, but it'd be really cool if you told us what you thought of this when you first saw it. I would predict that Native women really liked this movie because it was geared, I think, towards that, the vibe of the whole movie.
Yeah, and there is, you have. I mean, there's so much more that, subtext, which we can get into later. But while we're on this sort of romantic theme, like, this parallels Dances with Wolves in that you have two white people, both finding themselves suddenly in native homelands, native spaces, finding each other, falling in love, which is exactly what happens in Dances with Wolves. But you also, had this other sort of, there's something okay as a viewer with Hawkeye and Cora falling in love. But then you have this sort of forbidden love between Uncas and the younger sister, whose name I cannot remember, Alice. And they never, I watched this not too long ago, but they never really touch. He holds her when she finds out that her father's been killed, but there's no, real physical contact other than you know, not romantic at all, just sort of comforting. And yet they end up being the Romeo and Juliet of the whole film. You have Russell Means as Chingachgook, he's also sort of this romantic figure because he ends up being the last of the Mohicans. Spoiler alert, like, if you haven't seen this movie, Uncas dies and Alice dies. And Chingachgook ends up being the last of the Mohicans. And so there's this sort of romance around that. There's this settler nostalgia around that. I think it's a very funny, kind of awkward speech that Russell Means gives, because I am the last of the Mohicans. And I think they took that comment right off of the Leatherstocking Tales, and didn't really change it, because it was a little bit stilted. But there's a lot of romance, and I think the cinematography adds to that. The cinematography and the music adds to it. And if you contrast that with Dances with Wolves, like, I didn't find that romantic at all. I found that film just brutal in so many ways, and uncomfortable and laughable, and we've done reviews on that. So, but this film, there was a different vibe to it, definitely, for sure. I mean, and problems, all sorts of problems, from why is it that Uncas speaks really good English? Yes, he went to a boarding school, and Magua says Magua does not like this. Magua's like, Magua is like almost like a Sesame Street character. I mean, he refers to himself in the third person. He, yeah, poor Wes Studi, because this film really created a lot of press for him, and he became very well known. But it was so sad to make him say some of those lines.
Okay, well, so much to unpack there. Okay, so Wes Studi was also in Dances with Wolves, right? And he was also like the bad guy in Dances with Wolves. What was his character? It was another famous character.
He never, I don't think he had a name. He was the Pawnee. He was the bad Pawnee.
He's just the bad Pawnee who was always mean mugging and trying to kill people. And so then and these movies came out in the same year. And then in Last of the Mohicans, he's the bad Huron, Magua, who's also always just mean mugging. And his entire storyline is he wants to get revenge against Cora and Alice's father, who's like the British general, for, something. Did he kill his family or something like that? I don't remember but good on you, Magua, for taking out that settler for killing your family, that colonizer. Okay, I'm with you on that journey. But yeah, this was like this movie paired with Dances with Wolves, because they came out in the same year, right? These two movies were just like quintessential for the and what I feel like is still very much the way that Native characters are narrated in a lot of television shows and movies. And so Wes Studi being an OG in this, and Eric Schweig, Russell Means to a lesser extent. Russell, he wasn't really like in more movies after this. That was kind of a one-off, right? But Eric Schweig and Wes Studi become these like OGs. 5 years later, Smoke Signals comes out, if you all remember this. So Smoke Signals came out in 1997. And that is the first time that there's like a Native director, really, of a very popular movie that's populated by Native characters. And so there's something that's like happening between 1992 and 1997. And we've talked a lot about Wes Studi on Red Power Hour, like how he shows up again in Reservation Dogs circa 2021 as this really cool character that we've never seen him be. And it's because the particular way that Native people are represented and narrated because of these two films, like specifically because of Last of the Mohicans and Dances with Wolves. There's like a typecasting where, Wes Studi just becomes like the bad guy, the bad Indian in all the roles where he's not allowed to speak, or he's like the stoic, he's like the stoic, like phenotypic Indian, essentially, for the American white imagination. And so I think it's important for folks to understand how essential these two movies that come out in 1992 are to when we talk about like the history of Native people, not just in American cinema and American television, but also like the way that colonization gets reproduced throughout all of the Westerns, essentially, because throughout the subsequent 30 to 40 years. The importance of the two films, Last of the Mohicans and Dances with Wolves, cannot be overstated in terms of their enduring impact on the way that Hollywood sees Native people. And I say this partly because I think everyone already knows that Dances with Wolves is this kind of like quintessential Western. It's like one of the most famous Westerns that will ever have been made, like ever. Maybe The Searchers and Dances with Wolves are perhaps the two most famous Westerns in the entire history of American cinema. And so, of course, Last of the Mohicans comes out the same year as Dances with Wolves. And even though most people wouldn't think maybe of Last of the Mohicans as a Western, because the term Western kind of denotes a period of history that's probably 19th century and later, like mid 19th century and later, kind of the westward expansion of the story of how the United States became what it is today. And it takes place in the quote unquote West, which in most people's minds, like that's a specific region or geographical area. But Last of the Mohicans is certainly a Western because of the frontier thesis that is built into that narrative as well. Because even though it's taking place like 100-ish years prior, it takes place like in the mid 1700s or the mid 18th century in what is current day New York, right? So it is earlier on in the history of what becomes the United States. Like the US hasn't even been founded, right? As this at the time that this story is being told, at least in the movie. So people may not think that it's a Western, but I watched the trailer a few times for this movie because I had not watched the trailer since 1992. And the trailer is really funny because the trailer is the only two people who feature in the trailer are Daniel Day-Lewis and Madeline Stowe. So it's the two white protagonists who fall in love and on the frontier or whatever. And the trailer actually says something about how two people find each other in quote unquote new land being carved out of untamed frontier. Quote. So that's the actual trailer for this movie. And that is to say, right, the famous kind of like frontier thesis, which is essentially this notion that comes from this historian named Frederick Jackson Turner. And the frontier thesis is that it's like the quintessential narrative of how the United States thinks of itself historically, and how it kind of reproduces its national identity. And I've talked about this in other contexts, and this is my version of the frontier thesis. But the frontier thesis is essentially a frontier where like civilization meets savagery, right? And like there's this epic battle between civilization, i.e., like white settler kind of Christian masculinity, savagery is like Indians essentially, right? And as the U.S. like moves westward and consolidates its imperial and national territories, it has to quote unquote like encounter and then also defeat, right, the savagery in order to uphold the project, this like righteous project of civilization. Also part of Manifest Destiny and the doctrine of discovery that are like really baked into this. And so the Western, yes, takes place in a particular place often or a particular geography, but the Western is like a misnomer in my mind from a Native perspective, because Westerns are really just about frontiers. That's all that Westerns are about. That is like if you strip everything back, that's all that a Western is. And so, and so then therefore it's really just about settler colonialism and like the grand narratives of triumph that settler colonialism likes to tell itself, particularly American settler colonialism. And so in that sense, Last of the Mohicans is totally in line with that, because the relationship, right, between Daniel Day-Lewis, Hawkeye, who's been like adopted into, well, I guess is he considered like one of the last of the Mohicans? I'm pretty sure in the trailer they say that he is one of the last of the Mohicans, even though he's a white guy. He's like playing Indian, right? And Cora, his love interest, she's this like proper English woman, right? She's just come over from England. She's encountering like America for the first time. And she makes all these comments in the movie about like, this is not what I expected. She's like, she and her sister Alice, once they get basically saved by, what's his name? Chingachgook, Uncas, and Hawkeye, they get saved from, the bad Hurons, the Magua people. They're like traipsing, they're being dragged through like the wilderness in these like frilly dresses that they were wearing. And as the movie progresses, their dresses get torn and get like really dirty and their hair gets all disheveled. And so you can see like in the characters of the two white sisters of the general, the actual like, them like going native as the movie progresses, as they go deeper and deeper into like the world of the Indians, on this frontier. And then of course they both fall in love with Indians. If we think of Daniel Day-Lewis as an Indian, which I don't, but the film wants you to think of him as an Indian, as a Mohican. And then of course his brother Uncas, played by Eric Schweig, the younger sister Alice falls in love with him. And of course he tragically dies. But just that main story, the love story between the two brothers and the two sisters, to me just seems like a really straightforward kind of frontier narrative kind of thing that is like definitively Western. And by definitively Western, I mean it's just about like the dangerous divide, like the thin blue line, right, between civilization and savagery. And so in my mind, I have thought this for a long time, I see both Dances with Wolves and Last of the Mohicans as Westerns.
Absolutely. I mean, I see the genre of Westerns as more of a conceptual storyline rather than an actual geographical region. And
okay, that's a better way to say it.
and when you were just saying that, I was thinking, yeah, absolutely. And we're hoping to have, as Melanie said earlier, that this podcast on Taylor Sheridan and sort of the uproar around not only Wind River, the whole Yellowstone trilogy, but also the fact that he has won the rights to Empire of the Summer Sun, which is a film about the Comanches and about Quanah Parker. And that also certainly geographically is going to be not entirely Western. I mean, the Comanches were wide ranging, but that's definitely going to be a Western. And I don't want to talk about that now because frankly, it makes me a little sick thinking about what he's going to do with it. But this film is absolutely, definitely a Western, and it absolutely, definitely is sort of the doppelganger to Dances with Wolves, even in the way it sets up the oppositional good Indians and bad Indians. And Magua, West Studi, is bad in both films. Also, there's scenes in the very beginning of the film where the colonists, so what are going to be the Americans, are actually seen as protagonists. They're good characters because these are the Americans. They're going to, they're carving out this world on the frontier, on the savage frontier. And then you have the Europeans, the French and the English, who are ridiculous. Like, they are made to look absolutely ridiculous. Just the same way in Dances with Wolves, it was the US cavalry or the US Army, who every single one of those people, from the very beginning of that movie to the end, every single one of them, except Kevin Costner, is an idiot, insane, dirty, stinky, just bad. And in Last of the Mohicans, the British are stupid. The French are stupid and sneaky because they hire the Hurons, and they don't care what the Hurons and Magua do to the British. And yet the colonists, because they're friends with Hawkeye and Uncas and Chingachgook, they're good. And you see, there's the one scene in the very beginning of the film where they're all playing. It it didn't look like lacrosse. It looked like, well, what we call in the Pueblo shinny, where they're playing a game and it's natives and colonists and children and men and no women. But they're all playing this game, and it looks like they're all friends. So you have this construct too, where you can very easily see who are the good characters and who are the bad characters. And in Last of the Mohicans, it's the French and English. It's anyone European. But the Americans, or the soon-to-be American colonizers, are actually seen as positive characters. In Dances with Wolves, every white person is bad, except for Stands with a Fist, who arguably is just not really there. She has no substance. The same way, I think Cora, she has a little bit more substance, I think, than Stands with a Fist, but not a lot. Like, she's not fully developed the same way that the male characters are, because this really is a film about masculinity and about the development and the definition of masculinity in in the mid 1700s in the frontier. And then, of course, you have, the good Indians and the bad Indians, and the Hurons were bad because they sided with the French, and the Mohawks were good because they sided with the English. But then where do the Mohicans fit in all of this? Because they're like, they're gone. No one ever really addresses the fact, like, why are they the last? What happened to them? I mean, the film doesn't.
Right, like the obvious declension narrative aside, and for folks who don't know, the declension narrative, which is this like famous trope in academic and popular history, like historical accounts of American history pertaining to Native people, is like, it's the end of the trail image, right? It's like Native people are just in a constant state of disappearing, or they have already disappeared, wiped off the face of the planet by a more superior civilization. And this is really sad and this is lamentable, but they have been lost, right? And so just the name of the movie, The Last of the Mohicans, is just like a just straight up declension narrative nonsense. And often you see, right, the declension narrative is also a literary device of like the settler colonial imaginary, right? Because you have to be able to imagine and then also to make happen the disappearance of the prior inhabitants of land that you're trying to claim that belongs to you, right? And so you have to disappear their language, their presence, their nationhood, their forms of governance, et cetera, to clear the land of any of that presence so that you can then claim that land and treat it as if that was always the way things were. That's basically right how settler colonialism operates. Um, and so you'll often see the declension narrative paired with the frontier thesis in these films and these treatments of Native people. And so Last of the Mohicans certainly does both of those things. It is very interesting that you talked about the colonists, because this right the movie is taking place in before the establishment of the U.S. during the French Indian War. You have the French and the British who are fighting each other. You have various indigenous nations who are allied with these European imperial powers. But then you have like the poor, American colonists, the poor colonists who will become Americans. And even at the very beginning of the film, Daniel Day-Lewis, I forget who he's talking to. I think it might be Cora. But he's saying like, the frontier is the only place where these good folk can, make a living and make a life for themselves. And so there's like the other narrative of like pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, that's also really baked into the psyche of American national life. And so on the frontier, like the American person, particularly the man, can be made and remade, right? And so that's the other aspect, going back to gender, about the frontier. And like this is how Americans see themselves, that, right, if you, this kind of enterprising individual, kind of in the image of like a rugged, strong frontier man taking care of his family and like building his house with his bare hands and killing a bear, with nothing more than an axe, like that kind of stuff. Like that is
Yep.
also very much in the movie. And I believe it's Phil Deloria, who has spoken about this a lot in the work that he's published. But Last of the Mohicans portrays those soon to be American, like poor colonists who are carving life out, carving a living on the frontier. At that moment, they're closer to indigeneity and savagery than they are to civilization, right? Because the civilization is epitomized by the British and the French who are fighting each other for control. And so this notion of playing Indian, and because they have such a close relationship with the three Mohican, characters or protagonists in the film, it's those figures become like the quintessential, like that's the origin story of like the American identity, right? It is a good identity. It's good because it has independence. It's good because it has ruggedness and self-reliance. And it's good because it is actually in commune with nature to a certain extent, but is able to utilize the resources of nature to protect like your family, and to do the work of God and those kinds of things. And that is just, you see that also throughout all of the Westerns. But there's essentially a narrative of like the inherent goodness of settlement, the inherent goodness of that frontier moving further and further and further west. And that these encounters between, these settlers, these original settlers and indigenous people, and there are a lot of actually academic historians who are really obsessed about the periods of history where there was like good and equal relationships between indigenous people, whether they're trade or intermarriage or like cultural mixing, relationships between indigenous people and early settlers, that those are periods that are not necessarily characterized by conquest. And so those are periods of American colonial, like colonial history that then becomes America, where we can actually see a different kind of relationship that's being established between indigenous people and settlers. And it would not necessarily be characterized as like settlers taking advantage of or like murdering or trying to take the land of indigenous people. And so Last of the Mohicans, I think, very much reproduces that particular narrative. And of course, the reason why white settler historians are really obsessed with those periods, like the colonial periods of American history, is because they don't have to talk about colonization. They don't have to talk about settler colonialism. They're like, shit was good. Things are good. These Indians and these like early settlers, they were on really good terms. They were BFFs, they had good relationships because they were both just trying to, make do and do their best, living out on the land because they had no power. Exactly. But of course, we know the long arc of settler colonialism.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you see, that's exactly like when Hawkeye and Cora are having this conversation, the same one that you were just referring to, and he was talking about, um, there was a reference in there um, um, to being an indentured servant, and this is the only place they can be free. And the indentured servitude certainly happened in colonial America before it became a country, and it's the one time also where the power dynamic is not skewed. You have these poor, maybe former indentured servants becoming more indigenized and being more on the same class level as the native people who have always just been trying to survive. And all of a sudden, you have this sort of romantic, here we go with this word again, you have this romantic ideal of the time where, yes, people were equal. Indian people were equal to colonizing people. But it's such a short period in a relatively short history of this country, because immediately when the United States became the United States, you started seeing this power structure completely, it built up, and all of a sudden there were hierarchy. There were hierarchies, and there was a class division between the poor people and the rich people who were wanting to seize all of the land and make those poor people not able to survive, but instead to work for the rich people and make them lots of money and grow tobacco. And then you had to bring in, because they killed all the native people, they committed genocide starting on the East Coast and moving west. Then they had to bring in enslaved African people because they didn't have enough people to enslave that were native to this area. And so that I can see why historians like that period, because it's a tiny little microcosm before genocide, the transatlantic slave trade, and before this country became an oligarchy, and before the insanity of what we have now. But still, I don't know. I I don't know. I'm thinking back because there were the two scenes. The one in the very beginning with the British soldier, and they find Uncas and Chingachgook and Hawkeye at this settlement, and it's their friends, and they're playing the ball game, and they're having a grand old time. And he and the British soldier, the guys in red, come in, and he says, we're trying to raise a colonial militia to go fight the French, and you need to do this because this is king and country, we're your protectors. And the colonials are saying, we don't want to leave, because if the Huron are marching south, our families aren't safe. And he says, well, you don't have a choice. Like, we're not going to ask you nicely. Now you don't have a choice. You have to go and help defend whatever fort it is, Fort McWilliam or something. And you see that. And then the next time you see this settlement, everyone is dead. So in the space of a movie, you destroyed that romantic ideal, that one time in U.S. colonial history where Native people were on an equal footing with the colonists, and it's gone in a 2-hour movie.
Yeah. I mean, I understand like wanting to have historical accuracy. So I did part of my graduate training at Yale, which has the most renowned Western history department in the entire world. Okay. I was not in history. I was in American studies, but I took some history classes, and I took a history class on something called New Indian History, which is still a thing. I wish I really wish historians would stop doing New Indian history because it basically reproduces everything we are talking about here. But New Indian history, like a lot of the books, and these are like award-winning, like considered top-notch in the field of American history books. A, a huge chunk of those books really focus on like the American colonial period. And so this is how I came to understand history, like how American historians write about Native people and like why they're so obsessed about these little slivers where I'm sure that there was like exchange and like, I forgot, there was this trope in history. What was it called? It wasn't exchange. It wasn't the contact zone. It was essentially like a framework that historians reproduced ad nauseum for a really long time in New Indian history that was about like the equal relationship and coming together of indigenous people and settlers in like early American colonial period. And there was like such a pushback also in a debate about whether or not the word genocide was an appropriate term to use when we're talking about like how like the treatment of Native people by the United States. And so you can, anyway, I'm just trying to trace this for people because I think it just really helps to illustrate that at its base, this kind of imaginary is like very American, but it's really just about normalizing and naturalizing and not challenging settler colonialism. Because settler colonialism requires the elimination of Native people, the liquidation of them from their lands, and the complete destruction of who they are and the integrity of who they are as nations, pre-existing nations of people, and therefore tries to minimize and erase their rightful legal and moral claims to land that the United States now claims as its own, which I feel like is what history actually is. But a lot of historians don't think that that's history. I'm really not lying to you. They might as well have just made this movie. Actually, these are people with PhDs, and honestly, they're just telling the exact same fucking story that Last of the Mohicans or Dances with Wolves tells. And it's very just talking a bit more about these like American colonists, the ones that got murdered like 40 minutes into the movie or something, the Friends of the Indians. You know, and again, Phil Deloria has written a lot about this, that white settler Americans need to play Indian. They need to literally dress up as Indigenous people, or they need to create these popular tropes like the captivity narrative, or the popular tropes like, you know, the being friendly or closer to the land, or being closer to indigeneity and savagery, essentially, in these frontier scenarios, because it naturalizes their relationship with the land. It's like, look, these colonizers built their entire lives from the land itself. They were friends with Indians. The Indians knew the land better than they did at that point. Look, they're more Indian than you are. You know what I'm saying? It's like settlers know the land, and it's all about their relationship with the land. And this obsession in the American imagination of how like American settlers have just like a unique relationship with the land. They own the land. They're the ones who know how to work the land. Taylor Sheridan, I'm going to talk a lot about this. He's on my mind a lot with this. He owns 250,000 acres in Western Texas. Talk about the quintessential white settler man. Like, he is a land owner. And so it's all about naturalizing the settler relationship with land that doesn't belong to them, that is Indigenous land. And if they can claim to be Indigenous, this is also partly where the pretendian phenomenon comes from. If they can claim to be Indigenous, whether it's through marrying and having kids with an Indigenous person, or having close relationships on the colonial frontier with Indigenous people, whether or not, if they can like cast themselves and use kind of like Indigenous iconography to think of themselves as Indigenous, then that brings them closer to this possessive claim of the land that is really essential to like settler identity, which again is just basically the basic building block of the United States. And so anyway, Last of the Mohicans really helped me see that a lot more clearly. And I find that really disgusting, because it's not just in popular film. that this trope plays out. It's playing out again in all of Taylor Sheridan's shit that he's producing right now in 2024. And it also plays out in